More than a century before the first powered aeroplane flights, men broke free of the Earth, exploring the mysteries of the atmosphere in machines that were lighter than air.
KKOB. Larry Aarons here at this bicentennial Diamond Jubilee 16th Annual Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta. There's a huge crowd here at the Fiesta grounds.
Today, the hot air balloon is used almost exclusively for fun.
Oh, what a show. Wow! Wow! That's absolutely spectacular. What a crowd thrower.
The art and science of ballooning has evolved over 2 centuries, and balloonists have made some spectacular journeys. They've crossed the Atlantic Ocean. They paved the way for astronauts to fly into space. Over 100 years ago, they had flown higher than Mount Everest to unlock the secrets of the upper atmosphere. The first balloon flights were made in a field near Annonay in France in the summer of 1783. "200 years later, the town still honored their most famous citizens, the Montgolfier brothers, with a pageant to reenact some of their achievements. France is proud of its position in history as the birthplace of aviation. Joseph Montgolfier started with small balloons filled with smoke. He was joined by his brother Etienne, and together they tried different combinations of paper and cloth to contain the gas. They believed it was the smoke rather than its heat which held the balloon aloft, and they used damp straw to generate it. A French nobleman, François Pilâtre de Rosier, joined them as pilot. By November, they were ready with a balloon which could carry 2 men. The first ascent was made from a royal palace in the Bois de Boulogne. Watched by the King and Queen of France, de Rosier and another nobleman, the Marquis d'Arlande, rose gently into the air. The Marquis left an account of their flight.
We rose up on the 21st of November in the year 1783 at 6 minutes to 2 in the afternoon. The balloon ascended with majesty. I was surprised at the silence amongst the people, believing them to be amazed and perhaps fearful at this strange spectacle. At this moment, de Rosier cried, "You're doing nothing and the balloon is hardly rising." "Forgive me," I replied, and placed a sheaf of straw upon the fire. Astonished, I glanced downwards. "There is the river," I said to my brave companion. "We shall be sinking in it soon," replied de Rosier. "Some fire, my dear friend." With my fork, I seized a bundle of straw and threw it in the middle of the flames. An instant later, I felt myself, as it were, being lifted bodily up to heaven.
At one point, small fires started in the fabric, which the Marquis extinguished with a wet sponge. As they floated over Paris, de Rosier coolly ignored his companion's pleas that he should bring the balloon down. "25 minutes after takeoff, they landed safely 5 miles away. The flight was a sensation in Paris and around the world. After centuries of trying, man had successfully taken to the air. While the world still marveled at the flight, another balloon was being prepared. This time it was filled with hydrogen, a light but highly flammable gas. The pilot was Professor Jacques Charles of the Academy of Sciences. His companion was Noël Robert, the man who'd found a way to coat silk with rubber to hold the gas. In the space of 2 weeks, Paris had witnessed 2 sensational flights. The next great challenge for balloonists was to cross the 22 miles of sea separating France from England. Jean-Pierre Blanchard, a French balloonist, persuaded Dr. John Jeffries, an American living in England, to back him financially. They set out from Dover on a cold day in January 1785. They had to jettison everything, even most of their clothes, to lighten the load. But the winds were favorable and they arrived over France, cold but triumphant, the first men to cross the Channel by air. François Pilâtre de Rosiers also attempted the crossing, but his balloon caught fire and he was killed. His death marked the end of the first chapter in the story of manned flight. Ballooning took off in Europe and America. Some balloonists flew for fun, others flew for profit. Soldiers took to the air to spy on their enemies. In 1836, an Englishman, Charles Green, flew 380 miles from London across Belgium to Weilburg in what is now West Germany, an epic journey for its time. But balloonists suffered from a major disadvantage. They had no way to steer their craft. They were at the mercy of the winds. They had little idea where each journey would end. On the other hand, balloons were a perfect way to travel straight up. They provided scientists with an ideal way to explore the atmosphere, to find out how temperature, pressure, and humidity varied with altitude. In 1862, an English scientist, James Glaisher, teamed up with a balloonist, Henry Coxwell, to fly 6 miles above the Earth, higher than anyone had flown before. Today we take oxygen to such heights. They had none. Passing 27,000 feet, Glaisher's eyesight began to fail. It was essential that they stop the balloon's rise. Coxwell found that the line, which released hydrogen, was snagged. Glaisher passed out from lack of oxygen while Coxwell struggled into the rigging to free the line. His hands were so cold he had to use his teeth. He managed to release some hydrogen and the balloon started down. Glaisher could have died, but both men recovered and went on to become national heroes for their courage in the pursuit of science. In the age of the balloon, there were many attempts to power them and fit them with some system of control. Such craft were known as dirigibles, literally steerable balloons. Today they're called airships.
An airship has enormous presence. When you see your airship take off, I mean, it's a fantastic sight. The size of the thing, the grace of the thing when it's flying.
Clear vectors! Clear two!
The vectored thrust, although they tried to use it in the old days, they didn't actually have the technology to make it work successfully. With the propellers inclined upwards at 45 degrees, the airship leaps away from the ground very, very smartly indeed, with typically a takeoff run of no more than a foot or two. It's exciting, but it's controlled excitement nowadays. From a pilot's standpoint, in a lot of ways, it's very unlike any other flying machine. Anyone who's come from the boating world will feel a lot more at home because it handles more like a boat. Nothing happens immediately, and then it starts to happen slowly and progressively, and then you actually have to put in a counter control to keep the thing turning at the rate you require. Airships are designed as being slightly unstable, so they do tend to wander off track slightly, and you have to correct them. Because unlike a boat, you've got to cope with that both in the horizontal plane and in the vertical plane. And you've got a control yoke which does all these things. You turn it just like a car, you push it forward and move the elevators down, and the ship descends.
Controlling an airship was not always that easy. In France, the airship was pioneered by a Brazilian, Albert Santos Dumont. He built a succession of frail and often unwieldy craft. By 1903, he had refined his design sufficiently to win a 100,000 franc prize for a 7-mile flight from the headquarters of the Aero Club of Paris round the Eiffel Tower and back. As airships developed, they were used to take people on pleasure flights. Passengers had a glimpse of Paris laid out like a map, the site which had greeted Pilâtre de Rosiers over a century before. But it was in Germany, France's close neighbor and rival for power in Europe, that the greatest strides in airship design were made. Germany's airships were powerful symbols of technical progress and national pride. They were huge. Unlike early French models, they were rigid structures of lightweight girders containing several hydrogen-filled balloons. The architect of Germany's lead in airship design and construction was an elderly and aristocratic cavalry officer, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin. When the shadows of war fell over Europe in 1914, the German Navy had long-range airships to keep a lookout for the enemy's fleet. But the temptation to use them as bombers proved too great. In 1915, Germany bombed Yarmouth, a small English coastal town, killing 4 people, the first aerial bombing of civilians in history. The British shot down several Zeppelins by day, so Germany struck again at night.
It was wonderful as long as you could fly in the dark. You felt you were undetected, and then all of a sudden there would be a searchlight far in the distance, like that. All of a sudden you were in the middle of the beam. And immediately afterwards, there were 6, 7, 8, 12 others focusing on you. And then the anti-aircraft would start shooting at you.
The target was London. Britain answered with fighters, searchlights and guns, making the airship captains' lives increasingly difficult.
You were happy enough if you found London. You were even happier if you could drop your bombs. And you were happier again if you could drop them and go home as soon as possible.
Germany paid a high price for its air raids on Britain. Zeppelins were expensive to build. Filled with hydrogen, they were highly vulnerable to attack. The price in men was small by the standards of that war, but it was a fiery, horrible death. Britain's airships were mainly small, non-rigid types. Their main task was to patrol coastal waters as lookouts for the Royal Navy. Launching them was a battle with the elements.
Whatever wind there was, either tended to lift it, buffet it to one side or the other, and so therefore you had to have pretty strong people hanging on to it. Very often the wind would blow it round so suddenly and so forcefully that people were taken round with it, hanging on to the tow rope. But finally you got it on an even keel. I was on this ground party, getting an airship airborne. And to do that, you had 3 people either side of the gondola. And actually there's a bomb mounted on either side too. So you had to be careful of that. The order came to heave-ho, and I had an ordinary jacket tunic on. And without noticing it, it had caught in the broken fin of the bomb on the port side. And as the airship went up, I went up with it. But luckily only about 12 feet. And the whole thing tore off naturally, and I fell. And my pride was bruised, I think, more than my body. You could gain height by elevator control. You could turn fairly easily with rudder control. Pilots steered with what looked like a helm, and the controls were grotty-looking wire going back outside, so that a gust of wind could break one easily, and break an elevator control, rudder control, with disastrous results. Being so slow-moving, if there were enemy aircraft about, heavier than air aircraft, you would be a sitting target for them, obviously. A lot of airships that served where they could meet aircraft did have armament aboard, a Vickers or a Lewis gun. If the weather was fairly decent and the sea wasn't too rough, you could see into it quite a distance. Even if the submarine was submerged, you could see from the air a lot easier than a ship could see from the surface. The U-boat captains hated to have an airship hovering around above them, and the reason for this was because they could either surface and attack the airship, in which case they knew that he would then drop his bombs, or be in touch with a naval surface ship which would come along and depth charge him. Either that or he had to stay down. So he would try to lose you by moving or getting deeper and deeper. But eventually he'd have to come up. I have been airborne on a mission when we have dropped both of our bombs and missed the submarine. So he surfaced, manned his machine gun, and before we could get too far away, shot at us. If it punctured the envelope, naturally you lost gas. You often had to patch an airship in the air. You carried patching equipment with you. And obviously the chap was shooting at you from the bottom. The bullets came into the bottom of the airship, and you could reach that like a chap wallpapering. You could put a patch on.
Airships did valuable service for the Navy, gathering information and reporting back to the fleet. But they were large, slow, and vulnerable. By the end of hostilities, they looked obsolete as a weapon of war. After the war, Germany was prevented from building airships for her own use. The Zeppelin Company maintained its expertise by building one for the United States Navy. Once they were freed from restrictions, the company embarked on a massive new civil airship. It was named after Count Ferdinand, the Graf Zeppelin. It was the biggest airship in the world. The Germans took great pride in their achievement and quickly established a world lead in passenger airship travel. Regular services were flown across the Atlantic to New York or to South America in only 2 or 3 days. Eventually, the Graf Zeppelin circled the Earth. Each flight was a luxurious adventure.
There was a little sort of steps, and they ushered you up, and you realized that you were not in the Zeppelin, you were in this gondola which hung down below. And it looked tiny until you got in it, and then you realized it was 55 meters long. And then, as they let us go, you gradually felt a sort of lift, as if you were in a small boat and you come to the crest of a wave. You know, you feel yourself going up to the top and then gradually going down. And we didn't go down, we just went on going up.
Die Erde verschwindet, weil ich spüre keine
The ground disappears beneath. There's no noise, no vibration. Everything is as quiet as a mouse. The ground just vanishes away. Then, when we reach a certain altitude, I'm signaled from the control gondola. There's a ringing bell, an urgent sound, and a moving indicator. Engines full ahead. 1,420 revolutions. And so the engines are started and run up to the proper speed. Oh, they hummed so beautifully, so smoothly, they could send you straight to sleep.
Very smooth, very quiet, very hushed, and superbly efficient. I mean, real German efficiency at its best. The other people you saw were the officers who came and talked to you politely, but the real people running the Zeppelin, the rest of the passengers didn't see them.
Jeden Morgen gab's frisch gebackene Brötchen.
Every morning there were freshly baked rolls. Lunch, 5 o'clock tea, with freshly baked cakes, of course. The cooks, in my opinion, were, I believe, the busiest of the crew. Sometimes they were poorly appreciated, I think. You always get some passengers who complain all the time.
And they would come one after the other to breakfast, and many liked to stay sitting there, occasionally standing up, going to the window and looking out. There was always something to see from the ship, even over the sea, because we flew so low. Normally we were between only 250 to 500 meters. There was certainly no boredom. Some passengers would write reports on typewriters, others read a book. What we offered on board was very similar in many ways to that which was offered on board an ocean liner.
I have a certificate presented to me by Aeolus, rather than Neptune, proving that I have crossed the equator in a Zeppelin. There was a tall officer coming along and he clicked his heels and said, "You are the first Englishwoman to cross the South Atlantic in a Graf Zeppelin, and I congratulate you, and would you care to see round the Zeppelin?" Would I care? There was a catwalk which went from nose to tail, and looming over everything, the gas. It was squishy when you touched it. didn't like it at all. And there was a doorway. Well, there was a man sitting there, apparently 2 hours at a time. They sat there watching the engine. And there was no handrail, there was no nothing. There was just you and the Atlantic.
Da aber die Maschinengondel paar
As the
Meter
engine gondola was a few meters out from the main hull of the airship, there was a connecting ladder.
da ging dann die Türe oder die
When we wanted to go down into it, a sort of door or flap could be opened, and you climbed down the ladder. The first time it took a bit of courage, but we got used to it.
When we saw a whale being attacked by sharks, and we were low enough to see the blood, I mean, that was wildly exciting. You felt you could lean out and touch the mountains. It was absolutely superb. This was just gliding like a sort of, I don't know, a dream more than anything else.
In Britain, 2 giant sheds at Cardington in Bedfordshire still mark the site of the Imperial airship scheme. 60 years ago, the British government saw airships as a means of linking the empire by air. 2 were ordered, the R-100 and the R-101. The R-101 was comparable in size to the Graf Zeppelin, but Britain lacked the expertise in building and operating airships which had been learned in Germany. It was overweight, it leaked, and it was pressed into service before being properly tested.
So we came out of the hangar at 5 o'clock, about 5 o'clock in the morning. It was quite dark, in semi-darkness. And the ship was walked out of the shed and then was transferred to the mooring mast, which was about a mile across the aerodrome. Everybody naturally thought that this was the beginning of a new era for long-distance passenger flights, deluxe travel, but in much quicker time than a normal ship at sea would do it.
Lord Thompson of Cardington, the Secretary of State for Air, was impatient to fly to India. There were protests that more trials were needed, but Lord Thompson insisted that it leave on schedule. There were 54 passengers and crew on board.
As far as the crew were concerned, nobody was unhappy about leaving. Nobody was worried about it.
R-101 was loaded with provisions for the flight, including champagne and, by one estimate, a ton of luggage for Lord Thompson. In the early evening, he climbed aboard for what was the airship's first flight of any distance. Quite a crowd had gathered to see her depart.
My father and I had been out on the day when the R-101 left on this fateful trip to India, and we got to Cardington when she had just left the mooring mast, and so we saw her go. I said, wouldn't it be lovely to be in her? And I always remember my father said, no, I'd rather stay with my feet firmly on the ground. I think he had heard quite a lot of rumors and worries that perhaps she had not done enough trials. She went very slowly, and she certainly didn't seem to gain very great height before she actually disappeared from our sight.
All of a sudden, the ship struck and blew up immediately, in one complete flash. And looking at into the brightness, all you could see was a huge flame and the noise, a terrific explosion. That's all.
In the night, the R-101 had crashed into high ground near Beauvais in France. 48 of the 54 people on board, including Lord Thompson, died in the fire. The 6 survivors were flown back to Britain to tell of their experience.
I suddenly looked back and there were sparks following behind me. I suddenly realised my hands were hurting, the backs of my hands were hurting, so I ran along with my hands in the air. I head down and I ran straight into the side of a cow. 2 chaps in white smocks came running towards me, and when they saw me they crossed themselves. They then took me to the hospital. I finally found I had both hands burnt on the back and my face was burnt. While I was in hospital in Beauvais, I was blind for about 3 days. In the next bed to me, it was a rigger who was on patrol in the keel of the ship. He died the next morning.
It was British aviation's Titanic.
People might have heard of ships sinking and large numbers of people being drowned, but I don't think there'd ever been so many people fall out of the sky one day before and be killed.
The dead were buried together at Cardington.
And I shall never forget seeing that long, long procession come. 48 coffins. And there were carloads and lorry loads of wreaths and flowers. And slowly they came, and slowly the coffins were unladen, and they were carried through the gates into one large grave, which was dug just inside the gate where they were all placed in lines. Because they didn't know whose coffin was whose, I don't think. Because I think they were terribly burnt, weren't they?
The cause of the disaster was never determined. Britain's other airship, the R-100, was broken up. The Imperial airship scheme was abandoned. Others were not deterred.
The loss of the R-101 has not shaken one iota my confidence in the practicability of rigid airships and their great value as a means of international communication and transportation over the oceans.
In America, Admiral William Moffett headed the Navy's airship program. Once again, great national pride was at stake. 250,000 people watched the First Lady, Mrs. Herbert Hoover, launch the Akron in August 1931. But behind the celebrations, Moffat's dedication to airships was controversial.
He had to fight the battleship admirals for money. He had to go to Congress and convince Congress that we had to have money for airships, which he did very vigorously. And he got money for airships. I think the contract price was about $3.5 million. You couldn't build one of those ships a day for $200 or $300 million.
Moffett saw airships performing the same role they had in the war, long-range maritime patrols. To increase their effectiveness, they carried aircraft.
They had a trapeze, and then the airplane had a hook on it. The trapeze would lower them down about 20 feet below the belly of the airship, and then his engine would be going, and he'd trip his latch, and he would be free from the trapeze, and he would take off, and he was flying. He was an airplane. You had 4 planes on some of those ships. The planes would go out in all directions, far beyond the airship, and report back, of course, what they saw. We had a hangar inside of the ship. And then the pilot would maneuver his plane up and hook onto this thing, and then he'd be hoisted back up into the hangar in the airship.
The Navy found that their airships had other uses.
Remember one time President Roosevelt made a trip from Washington to the Panama Canal to Honolulu, and so we were ordered to deliver newspapers to him. Imagine that. So we took a bunch of San Francisco newspapers and went way down there to hell and gone between Honolulu and Panama and dropped these newspapers on the deck of his cruiser. We were going to moor out at Camp Kearney, which is right outside of San Diego. The first big airship ever was out here, and we got a lot of sailors from North Island to come out and act as a ground crew. They'd never seen an airship before. They had to be trained on very short notice, and their training, of course, was very primitive. Well, all of a sudden, the main wire holding the airship down parted.
The men were pulling down on the guy lines, and suddenly there was a gust of wind, which turned the nose of the ship up, and suddenly it went up into the air.
I yelled with a microphone to all these people. I said, "Let go, let go, let go." But a few of them just hung on for dear life because they'd been told to.
We were carried 200 feet into the air. Seaman Edwell and Kenton could hold on no longer. Their grips loosened, and...
Two of them dropped off. One of them dropped very close to where we were, and the one we could see dangling from the airship from a great height. And later we learned that he had held onto the rope with one hand and tied the rope around his waist with the other, and he was saved. The thing that I think that impressed me the most was the fact that he was able to hold on with one hand and tie that rope around his waist with the other hand. I remember going out to a pepper tree out in our backyard where we had a rope hanging and trying to do the same thing, and realized that no young boy could have the strength to do that. It impressed me very much.
Why didn't you jump when you saw you were being taken aloft?
Well, I felt it put the lives below me in danger.
What was your sensation when you were hauled into the Akron?
It was a grand, glorious feeling to get inside once more.
America's Akron and her sister ship, the Macon, were both lost in crashes at sea. While Britain and America suffered disasters with airships, Germany's Graf Zeppelin went on carrying fare-paying passengers. The architect of their success was Hugo Eckener. He commanded the Graf on many of her flights. They were welcome everywhere.
It was chaotic. It was a carnival. Great fun. And there were big trapdoors in the front which opened, and the ropes seemed to be quite remarkable. The way they seemed to roll down in the air and then open up to a huge cut-o'-nine tails. And then all my team, I love that, my team, made a dash and grabbed them and started running backwards. And I forsake my post, and instead of running backwards with them, I made a dive for the gondola because I wanted to get my hands on it. I wanted to be right there to get a grip on the actual airship itself. That's what I wanted. I found a spot there, grabbed the rails, and it turned out to be exactly under the window that Dr. Hugo Eckener used to lean out, to sign autographs, to talk to reporters and everything else. You realise when you were looking at him, you were looking at the brains behind the Zeppelin. You were like a god to me looking up at him. There he was in command of a Zeppelin, a thing like that. Oh, terrific.
The Zeppelin Company passed into state control under Hitler, but not Hugo Eckener.
Hitler didn't dare to touch Dr. Eckener because Dr. Eckener was so well known internationally. They held parades in honor of Hitler, and Dr. Eckener would walk in the parade, but he refused to say Heil Hitler. And Dr. Eckener refused to knuckle down to Hitler.
Nazi money completed Germany's greatest airship, the Hindenburg. Eckener had hoped to use helium, a non-inflammable gas, but America had a monopoly on it.
Because of Hitler, our government refused to give helium to Germany. And I'm sure it came from the very highest places. The president himself. Nothing would have ever happened to it if it had been filled with helium. Every time the Hindenburg would land from Germany, there'd be a flock of reporters and photographers come down from New York to witness this thing.
I enjoyed the trip tremendously. It was a real revelation. I realized that at last the commercial airship flying across the Atlantic can mean something.
We had a wonderful flight in a record time of about 50 hours from coast to coast. That is nearly half the time the fastest steamers need. I admit we had to make the flight under very favorable weather conditions. But I am convinced under all weather conditions, even on the most unfavorable, we will be able to make the flight in all regularity and safety. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
In 1937, the future of the Hindenburg looked promising. It was the last word in luxury, and Germany was the only country operating passenger services across the Atlantic. Until May of that year.
It's practically standing still now. They've dropped ropes out of the nose of the ship, and it's been taken a hold of down on the field by a number of men. The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It bursts into flames. Wait, get it started. It's fighting, and it's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's burning and bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast, and all the folks between us. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers screaming around it. I told you. I can't talk to people whose friends are on there. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen. Honest, it's just laying down massive smoking wreckage.
There had been so many deaths, culminating in the disasters of the R-101 and the Hindenburg, that for many years, passenger-carrying airships disappeared from the sky. Today, small helium-filled dirigibles are a familiar sight over many cities. Larger airships could one day provide surveillance platforms high above the Earth's surface as part of a country's strategic defenses. In the 1930s, the balloon was being rediscovered as a means of exploring the atmosphere. Auguste Piccard, a Swiss physicist, built a pressurized gondola. In 1931, he flew to 51,700 feet in the stratosphere and set a new world record. Like Coxwell and Glacier 70 years before him, it was an adventure. He stayed up overnight before landing on a glacier in the Alps. He broke his own record the following year and brought back information about the nature of cosmic rays and became an international celebrity. High-altitude ballooning in pressurized gondolas became an international endeavor. A race developed between the Soviet Union and the United States to set ever higher records. In 1933, Soviet balloonists set a new world record of 58,000 feet. America responded 2 months later with 61,000 feet. On the next Soviet flight, all 3 balloonists died when their gondola broke free and fell to Earth. The climax to the rivalry came in 1935, when 2 American military balloonists, Captain Orville Anderson and Captain Albert Stevens, set a new record of 72,000 feet. Their achievement was to endure until after the Second World War. In the 1950s, the stakes were even higher. The race was to get a man into space.
We didn't know just how to select a man to go into space. We also knew that when man go into space, that he'd have to have a pressure suit. We'd never had any real long-term exposure in a pressure suit. We also had very little experience on the selection of the atmosphere that we would want to breathe.
A great deal of research could be done in aircraft which could be flown to simulate weightlessness. But there were some tests which could only be done at very high altitudes using balloons.
We knew that when we go into space, a man was going to be getting outside of the capsule. We knew that he was going to walk into space. He was going to walk on the moon. We had never, ever done this. We had never, ever been outside of a spacecraft or anything with no pressure. And of course, the other objective was that once he got there, how to provide a means of escape, how to get back to the Earth in the event of a catastrophe at high altitude.
There would have to be an ultimate test.
I knew that if anything went wrong with that pressure suit, that I was dead.
Weighed down by his suit, a parachute, a film camera on his back, and breathing apparatus, Joe Kittinger was to ride an open balloon capsule to more than 100,000 feet and at the exact moment, jump out.
The reason why we were there was because it was a balloon. There was no aircraft that would get us up to those altitudes to do these tests. And without a balloon, we couldn't have done it.
The balloon would rise almost to the edge of space, expanding as the atmosphere grew thinner.
I had to stay there for about 11 minutes while the balloon drifted over the exact spot that I wanted to drop. I had about 45 items that I had to go through on my checklist in order to separate from the capsule. I disconnect my kit from the oxygen equipment on the capsule. So I severed the umbilical cord before I jumped out. And it was a moment of truth. That was why I was there. So I was really kind of elated when it was time to go. And I started falling, and I was falling very rapidly. And I kept accelerating and accelerating, accelerating until I was faster than the speed of sound without an airplane at about 90,000 feet. But I fell into the Earth's atmosphere, got more dense, and I kept slowing down, slowing down, slowing down. And when the parachute opened, the opening shock was relief because the experiment was over as far as I'm concerned.
Joe Kittinger jumped from 102,000 feet, almost 20 miles high, a record for a parachute jump, and likely to remain so for a long time. The contribution made by Joe Kittinger and his fellow balloonists to the United States space program ended in 1961 when the altitude record was set at 113,000 feet, testing suits for Mercury astronauts. That record still stands. Ballooning still attracts those whose sole purpose is the search for adventure. In 1987, Richard Branson built a hot air balloon to fly the Atlantic.
We're gonna give it a damn good try.
The dream of crossing the Atlantic by balloon was almost as old as ballooning itself. But it had taken until 1978 for that dream to be realized by 3 Americans using a helium-filled balloon. The winds were the same, but the technology had changed. Branson used modern fabrics, gas burners, and radio.
It's not over yet. We've got the worst task ahead of us, landing the sea.
But you must have some sense of relief that you're over the big pond, anyway.
There's no doubt about that.
He touched down briefly in Northern Ireland, losing more of his gas supply. But he pressed on, trying to make his final landfall on the mainland of Britain. It was not to be. Virgin Atlantic drifted gently into the sea between Ireland and Scotland. Branson and his pilot, Per Lindstrand, had to be rescued by very modern methods.
Nita, I'm gonna punch these two out of here.
Modern technology has made hot air ballooning a safer sport for all. Today, many thousands of people are able to enjoy the serenity, the adventure, and the mystery of the oldest form of manned flight. After 200 years, balloons still have the ability to draw a crowd and turn heads. Advertisers recognize this age-old quality in balloons. They've sponsored a wide variety of shapes and sizes, which would have been a strange sight in the days of the Montgolfier brothers. Today's balloonists, like Joe Kittinger, freely acknowledge the debt they owe to those pioneers.
The early pioneers in ballooning took risk every time they flew. They had no knowledge, they had no background, they had no one who had preceded them. The debt that balloonists have to Rozier and Charles and Blanchard is the same debt that aviators have to the Wright brothers. They built the steps that we lived on, that we gained the knowledge from what the advances that they made.